I grew up a fan of TCGs ever since Pokemon was released in like the late 90s, I believe it was. Back when you had like those old structure decks with the fat Bulbasaur or Venusaur at the front. It looks really 90s now, but I've always played and collected TCGs since the release of Pokemon. And then 2002 kind of happened, and Yu-Gi-Oh kind of took over in the West. It was one of the biggest animes at the time, and the card game was booming. Then obviously you had the Magic the Gathering kind of being the grandfather of the TCGs and still most likely the most successful TCG currently out there. And the reason for this video is I feel like I've been through a lot with TCGs. You know, growing up with them and then kind of leaving them behind for a period of time, which I'll get into, and then kind of rekindling my love for tabletop TCGs. I feel like I can kind of understand where certain TCGs fail and where they succeed. And mentioning the first three I did, which was Pokemon, YGO, and Magic the Gathering. Those three are obviously the most successful TCGs in the modern era. I can't imagine any other TCG being more successful than these three. But I also feel like these three TCGs have remained prevalent for the sole fact that you can't replicate what they do. Now I guess we'll start with Magic the Gathering because it is one of the most popular TCGs ever, period. I do think a lot of TCGs have tried to replicate what Magic the Gathering has successfully done, in all honesty. Magic the Gathering has solely brought a whole land/mana system into play, the whole tapping the card for cost, things like that. You know, pardon me if I'm not using the right terminology. I'm not the most well versed in Magic the Gathering, admittedly. I think because it's been out for so long, it feels like since before I was born, potentially. It's one of those TCGs which kind of feels hard to get into at some point, unless you know like a friend or a family member that is already into Magic the Gathering and they can teach you Magic the Gathering. It can get a little bit overwhelming with a constant amount of new sets, and you've got the different formats with Magic the Gathering, so a little bit overwhelming, but at its core, Magic the Gathering is quite simple. They really kind of pioneered just the basic kind of text on the card. You know, you've got your trample, you've got haste, you've got flying, you've got all those basic terminologies on cards which have kind of been used by countless different TCGs. You know, whether it's worded slightly differently, like I was playing a TCG the other day and it had like a blocker, and I think there's in another different TCG, it's called Defender. It does the exact same thing, just worded differently, and I feel like Magic the Gathering really pioneered how easy it is to use, not only on their cards, but how easy it is to understand for their players. But obviously you've got the whole mana system, you've got the land system, you've got the tap system, you've got all those terminologies on their cards, and you've got their card design. And I feel like a lot of that has been attempted to be replicated by countless TCGs. We're all familiar with the TCGs that have tried to copy Magic the Gathering and Pokemon and all these other TCGs, but the one I want to start with is Magic the Gathering because I feel like the reason why Magic the Gathering succeeds as something that you just can't replicate is because of much more than its mechanics. Something that I think goes, I guess, a bit underappreciated at times is kind of the lore and the role-playing aspect of Magic the Gathering, which admittedly Yu-Gi-Oh doesn't have at all. Despite me absolutely loving Yu-Gi-Oh, it absolutely my favorite TCG, it doesn't have that role-playing aspect that Magic the Gathering just captures so perfectly. Being put in a role of a planeswalker and having a library of cards, as they call it, and everything you cast is a spell. Every monster is a spell. And you're fighting an opposing planeswalker, and their library of cards is what they've accumulated through the years. You know, we'll use that as kind of the best way to grasp what Magic the Gathering does so well. And you get a lot of other TCGs, like one of the big complaints with Keyforge, for example, despite them not being too comparable, Keyforge does have an extensive lore. You can go on their website, you can read their products. There is an extensive amount of lore. but it doesn't match the art style, it doesn't match the card design, it's too convoluted. Whereas every new set with Magic the Gathering, there's a new piece of lore. You kind of grow with these planeswalkers that you see everywhere, and you get to build a library of cards based on your planeswalker and how it best suits you as the planeswalker. The aesthetic of the cards really kind of make you feel like these are more than just playing cards. These are some like ancient spells scripted onto a card, you know, in a weird way. And I know it sounds a bit lame, but back when I was trying to learn Magic the Gathering, it was a bit difficult. You know, it was, admittedly, it's a lot slower than the TCGs I'm used to. It does pick up quite quickly, but the first couple turns can be quite sluggish. And I was like, I just don't know, you know, starting over a new game, you know, every time and it's going to be this slow. I don't know if it's for me. But then someone, I can't remember who it was, but they really just phrased it to me as simple as, put yourself in the shoes of the planeswalker. These are your spells, and you're fighting an opposing planeswalker. And that to me was one of the coolest things, because that kind of made me roleplay a little bit, which admittedly no other TCG has made me able to do it. So I think it's a mix of all of the perfect mechanics that Magic the Gathering has come to perfect throughout their years and years of dominance, as well as this mixture of almost authenticity with their card design and their card art. Everything feels real. Everything feels like it's lived through something, mixed with their lore and their RPG elements. Despite there not being any RPG elements built into the game, the backdrop to it is you're kind of role-playing. And I think that's one of the coolest things that separates this, and it's so hard to replicate. You know, you can have countless TCGs that try and replicate the mechanics or the art style or anything else, but it's very hard to try and simulate that RPG, you know, filling the roles of a spellcaster, of a planeswalker, and successfully doing it. And because of the history that Magic the Gathering has, it's hard to top that. And I think that's a big reason. I don't think a lot of people speak about it, but it's a big reason why it's still around today, because it just feels like there's a lot more there than you realize once you start role playing. I'm not even talking about, like, you know, having to talk like a spellcaster and, you know, ancient times. I'm not talking about any of that, but just kind of sitting down and saying, okay, I'm going to play this spell, and I understand this is going to have, you know, potential repercussions for me next turn, or it's going to potentially obliterate my opposing, you know, spellcaster, planeswalker, whatever you want to call it, opposed to just, okay, I'm gonna play this card, it does X amount of damage, I'm gonna play this card, I have to draw X amount of cards. No, when you look at it and slow down and kind of look at it from that point, the aesthetic matches that role-playing design, and the flow of the game matches that design. I don't know if that's intentional. I feel like it is. I can't confirm it, obviously, but I love what they've done. And something similar to that, to a different level, is Pokemon. Pokemon is obviously in my opinion, one of the three kings of TCGs. They've been around. They were the first TCG I ever got into in like the late 90s or early 2000s. And they do a similar thing with Magic the Gathering. Their mechanics are a bit different. They've obviously got the energy system, which kind of works similar to Magic the Gathering in their land system, but it's a little bit different. But I think where Pokemon really differentiates itself, and more so than any other TCG, this can't be replicated purely of how successful and big Pokemon is the history of fans of Pokemon. And I'm not talking about just being a fan of Pokemon. I'm not talking about those people that, okay, I've seen Pokemon, that's a Pokemon card, or, you know, that's Charizard, that's Pikachu. I can name those Pokemon. People mainly grew up playing the video games. You know, obviously, Red, Blue, Leaf Green, Fire Red. You had the Ruby, Sapphire, Emerald. You had Gold and Silver. These are historic games on the early Game Boy generation that we all grew to love. You know, they're still loved today. My favorite Pokemon games are the early classic Pokemon games. I played every Pokemon game except like Ultra Sun, Ultra Moon, because I just didn't like Sun and Moon, sue me. But it's that bond that people have playing those Pokemon games where, and it's quite common, and I'm included in this, where certain people will go through every Pokemon game transferring the certain Pokemon that they want to complete the game with, because they just grow attached to those Pokemon. You can name Pokemon, and that's an exciting thing because it helps build a different level of companionship, for lack of a better term. And that is absolutely something that no TCG can replicate because of that bond. If you open a booster pack, any Pokemon booster pack, you pull a Charizard, you pull a Typhlosion, you pull a Pikachu, you pull whatever, you can run that. There's no reason for you not to run it. If you pull your favorite Pokemon, you can build a deck based around your favorite Pokemon. And I think one of the coolest things that the Pokemon TCG does is, if you say you want to build a deck around Charizard, and I know Charizard's a very popular Pokemon to use, everyone loves Charizard, but say your favorite Pokemon is Charizard, you pull a Charizard from a booster pack, and you kind of build the deck based around Charizard. The feeling of playing the Charizard kind of brings over this weird rush of not so much nostalgia, but I can't quite put my finger on it. But it just feels like that bond is still there. You know, if I was obsessed with Lapras, you know, in the early gen, Lapras is one of my personal favorite Pokemon when I was a kid. And if I adored Lapras then, and I make a water deck, for example, and I have Lapras in there, and I play Lapras, I'm like, I feel like this Lapras has been with me through the last decade or 2 decades. And that's such a unique thing where Magic the Gathering has this really unique RPG undertone that when you really kind of let yourself be grasped by the RPG element of it, it's immensely more fun playing Magic the Gathering that way. And Pokemon, if you're a fan of Pokemon and you decide to play the Pokemon TCG after you played the video games, you know, if you were a kid or a teenager and you're an adult now, or even if you're a kid and you grow to be a teenager, having those Pokemon that you essentially grew up with to playing now, and you know, in a card game, it feels like you've had that bond with that Pokemon for a very long time. And I know that sounds a bit lame, but I just feel like it's just a fact. You know, people that loved Pokemon back then, they have this enhanced feeling when they play the TCG and they get to play their favorite cards. You know, obviously there's a pro scene, there's a meta, there's always a meta when it comes to pro TCGs, but I definitely feel like on a casual level, and I think this is more so than any other TCG, you can really have fun with just using your favorite Pokemon cards. You know, I've built decks based around Luxray, Typhlosion, and some of my other favorite Pokemons. You know, and you only got to run a few of them. You can really make it a party of your favorite Pokemon. If you want to run 6 specific Pokemon in your Pokemon deck, you absolutely can. So whilst the game is rather simple, and I think it's simple in a way where it's easy to pick up, like it's by far the easiest TCG I've ever learned. I learned it within an hour, and I feel like there wasn't too much more to learn. It was more trying to figure out what is optimal. But I think its simple, slower pace kind of lends into ensuring that you're making the right plays. A mistake that a lot of TCGs can make when they kind of make a slow one based, you know, around the Pokemon mechanic or the Magic the Gathering mechanic is it can get quite boring. It may be hard for your opponent to come back if you just make a really good play, and because it's so slow, it feels like a grind to even try and get back to even playing field while your opponent maybe just snowballs. And I feel like Pokemon is a really good TCG where, despite being very simple in its mechanics, it forces you to say, this is my one of only few moves this turn. I now have to anticipate how my opponent's going to react and how I can react to that potential reaction. And whilst that's not new to exclusive to just Pokemon, many TCGs have done that before. I feel like Pokemon executes it really well. Magic the Gathering also executes that really well, except there's generally a bit more going on in Magic the Gathering than there is Pokemon. And I do think the thing with Pokemon, with it being so simple, kind of lends into the fact that, you really think about the moves you're making with these Pokemon that you may have grown up with. You don't want to make stupid moves for the sake of making stupid moves. Whilst you can have fun, it's always, I don't know, it just kind of lends itself to the TCG as a whole and the heritage of Pokemon. And I think that's what separates those two super well. And it's something that I don't think can be replicated elsewhere because of that undertone of the RPG mechanics mixed with the perfection of those mechanics of Magic the Gathering, and then just that bond you have with Pokemon over the last 2 decades of just growing up watching the anime, playing the video games, and there's a plethora of them. Everyone's kind of played a Pokemon game. And I do feel like that's what separates these two from copycat TCGs. And I don't mean copycat TCGs in a bad way. I do like it when people try and implement successful mechanics into their card game and try and make it their own. But I do think it's super difficult to stand out against these two TCGs for the sole fact that they've kind of not only perfected what they're doing, but they have things which you can't replicate. And then on the other end, you have, I guess it's most of the last TCG I'll talk about, and it's my personal favorite, which is YGO. I think this doesn't have the bonds that you have like Pokemon. You just don't. Whilst, Blue Eyes White Dragon and Dark Magician, they're all beloved, nostalgic monsters or cards, whatever you want to call them. They don't have that same of rush that like a Charizard has, for example, or a Pikachu. Even parents know what a fucking Pikachu is, and no one's gonna know what this is. No one's gonna know what this is, and that's fine. YGO hasn't needed to have anything like that to succeed. In fact, what YGO does so well is purely in its mechanics, and it really has separated itself from every other TCG for better and worse. There's a lot of feedback everyone can give as a fan of YGO. It's not perfect. No TCG is, and YGO is far from it. But the thing that really separates YGO, it doesn't play like Magic the Gathering. It doesn't play like Pokemon. It doesn't play like any other TCG on the market. I've played a plethora. I've recently just picked up Wixis or Wecross, whatever you want to call it, the English edition. Tyler and I were playing it back when it was the Japanese one. We don't know any Japanese, but we learnt to play it because we love big teeny anime waifus on cardboard, apparently. But we played that. We've played Final Fantasy. We played the new Digimon TCG. We played Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh, Magic the Gathering. I'm familiar with Keyforge. I'm familiar with just a Cardfight Vanguard. All these TCGs which kind of come and go. Fire Emblem, for Christ's sake, that's never coming in English because it's been cancelled in Japan. It's not getting any more printings. And I've kind of learnt to play that. I just adore TCGs, and I don't feel like there's any quite like YGO in terms of its mechanics. Let alone its card design is quite unique. I don't think it's my favorite card design. Personally, I do think Magic Gathering kind of has the best card design. It just looks ancient. It looks mythical. Whereas YGO, I don't really know what it looks like. But it's fine. But I guess where it shines in its mechanics is purely in the fact that the limit of your deck is you. And that's the craziest thing about YGO. If you can play for 5-10 minutes in your turn, if you really want to, if you have the correct cards in your hand and in your deck, there is no resource management with YGO. There is like resource management, but there's no land system, there's no mana system, there's no energy system, there's no rune system. Every card in your hand is a resource for better or for worse, and it's up to you to make the optimal plays in YGO. You can end on a board which is unbeatable as long as you have the knowledge and the resources in your hand and deck to make that happen. You could have the exact same deck as your opponent, but if your knowledge and skill set of those cards is greater than your opponent, your board can be drastically different. Everything kind of feels like a toolbox in YGO. Whereas a lot of what Magic the Gathering and Pokemon do is they limit things with the mana system, with the energy system. You're going to play one at a time. And whilst there are ways around that, for sure, you've got different abilities and effects and spell cards, YGO off the bat says you can do whatever you want. If you've got cards in your hand and they're the right cards, you can make plays. And I think that's why I'm drawn to it, is because it's so exciting from the get-go. It's always a rush to try and make the best board you can. And whilst it is a bit of a detriment, admittedly, sitting there while your opponent plays for 5 minutes and you've got no interaction because you're going second can be a little bit rough. That's why hand traps were a thing, and hand traps have been very controversial. I'm not a fan of them. As you guys know, if you've watched my deck builds, I'm not a fan. But they're here to stay. And they're just so meta prevalent. But that's the thing, is they've created more cards and more play styles, so you can interact even if you shouldn't be able to interact, where a lot of Pokemon especially is kind of wait for your turn. Your opponent has their turn. You may have a couple ways to interact, but mainly you're waiting for your turn. Most TCGs kind of act that way. Yu-Gi-Oh! Really just says to hell with that. The goal is to stop your opponent from playing at this point, and that doesn't sound too fun, but trying to stop your opponent from playing is immensely fun. It's one of those things where you hate being on the receiving end of it, but if you're the one doing it, there's not much more joy in the world than that, in all honesty. And I think the complete lack of resources, every card is its own resource. There is no limit to what you can do. You can keep playing and playing and playing as long as you've got the knowledge and the appropriate cards to make those plays that you want to do. You can keep going. And I feel like that's what completely separates it from other TCGs. It doesn't compare to Magic the Gathering. It doesn't compare to Pokemon. It doesn't compare to any of the other TCGs I've mentioned. Even Keyforge, for that sake. I mean, you can play whatever you want as long as they're of the same suit or something like that. But it doesn't compare because there's a limit. Once you've played them, that's kind of it. YGO, you can play in your opponent's turn. And that's insane. And whilst you love it and you hate it at the same time, the purpose of this video is to kind of bring light to what separates these TCGs. So whilst Yu-Gi-Oh! Feels like it should have that history of nostalgia and that bond between certain cards, it doesn't. Like, maybe some people do, but as a whole, it kind of doesn't. And that's what, Pokemon is there for. Pokemon's kind of the king of that nostalgia here. And then you've got that historic, ancient feel, and that's what Magic the Gathering is. And YGO just kind of says, to hell with that. You can play whatever card you want as long as you're able to play it. And I think that's why these three TCGs are just so unique and so successful, is because if you plan on replicating YGO, you can't half-ass it. You really have to go all in and decide zero resource management. You can kind of do what you want, but you have to balance it. You can't consistently let someone do what they want without knowing how to balance it. YGO does know how to balance their stuff for the most part. And then obviously Pokemon and Magic the Gathering are kind of a bit more balanced in that regard because they have the inbuilt resource management in separate cards and separate rules around that. But they've got those aspects which just can't be replicated for the most part. And I think that's why these three TCGs shine so well and unable to be messed with. They've kind of on these pedestals where other TCGs try and replicate, mainly Magic the Gathering for that matter, because it's just so successful. But it can't be replicated because of all the things I've mentioned. And obviously these are personal opinions on TCGs as a whole. But I feel like I've playing TCGs off and on for the last 20 years. And just having a huge love for just tabletop games as a whole, and especially that of a cardboard card. I just feel like I've kind of can see where TCGs are trying to mimic or copy a certain mechanic or feel or style, and I can see why it doesn't work. It's because of all those little nuances between these three TCGs that simply can't be replicated, in my opinion. That is about it for the video. I just wanted to talk my thoughts. I like rambling a lot. Thank you everyone that has shown love for all the deck builds. We recently did like a Wixis unboxing. I'm going to keep calling it Wixis because WeCross sounds like a Wii Fit game. We want to do more and more TCGs. I've recently started playing Digimon, and Digimon is just a heap of fun. I think it's really unique with its memory system. I appreciate that because I don't feel like the memory system copies anything, and it's a completely new form of resource management, and it kind of makes it fun in itself with the evolutions and the inherent effects. Digimon feels like a breath of fresh air, and I can see why it's doing well. Whereas something like Dragon Ball Super, which I've played, doesn't feel unique enough. It felt, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I played quite a bit of Final Fantasy and I played a little bit of Dragon Ball Super, and Dragon Ball Super felt very similar to Final Fantasy, just not as good. For me, anyway. I know people love the Dragon Ball TCG. More power to you if you love it. Just wasn't for me. But I feel like, yeah, there are always TCGs trying to copy other TCGs. Obviously trying to make the best TCG possible, and that's a win for us all the time. If there's a TCG out there that can get the best of everything and we enjoy it, that's best for us. But the best is already kind of here, in my opinion. You've got your Pokemon, you've got your Magic the Gathering, you've got your Yu-Gi-Oh! But it's not stopping us from liking other TCGs. Like, I'm a big fan of Wixis, I'm a big fan of Digimon right now. I love all these TCGs, and I'm always eager to try new ones. I want to try a bit more of Cardfight Vanguard. The art looks completely wild. I've got mixed thoughts on the actual card design. But that's a discussion for another time. So I hope you guys liked me rambling. It's rambled for a bit long, but yeah, if you guys want to see more of it, let us know. Continue showing love in our other deck builds. We really, really appreciate it. We do have certain deck builds that you guys have requested, which will be on their way. It's just December is a crazy time throughout the year with work and obviously Christmas and New Year's. It's just a crazy time. So that is all from me. Thank you. Have a good night.